Day 14 of integration. Recommend immediate reassignment of all Threlcade candidates out of the human cohort. Repeat. Recommend immediate. They don't stop, that's the part nobody put in the briefing. They don't stop and they don't complain, and by hour 6 I stopped believing they were going to. Cadet Ressa Vinthal had trained for the Joint Coalition Officer Corps for 6 years before she ever set foot on Earth. And in all 6 years, nobody had once used the word afraid in connection with the humans. They used other words: unpredictable, resilient beyond expected parameters, statistically anomalous in endurance metrics. The coalition liked its language bloodless, and Ressa had absorbed that language the way every cadet absorbed it, without ever once translating it into something that might actually mean something on the ground. She translated it on day 1, standing in a gravel yard at 500 hours in air that was too thin for her lungs and too cold for her species' comfort range. Watching a human drill instructor named Master Sergeant Owen Kessler explain, in a voice that carried no anger and no theater at all, exactly what the next 14 weeks were going to look like. 23 of you, Kessler said, walking the lines slowly, hands clasped behind his back. 23 species represented across this cohort, if I'm reading the manifest right. First joint endurance program the coalition's ever run with a human training cadre in command. Some of you have been told this is an honor. He stopped walking. It's not an honor, it's a filter. And I want to be honest with you about that before we start, because I've found honesty saves everybody time. Beside Ressa, a young Vekthai recruit named Os shifted his weight, 4 legs adjusting in the unfamiliar gravity like he was still deciding whether to trust the ground. A filter for what? He asked quietly, not quite to Kessler, not quite to himself. Kessler heard him anyway. Human hearing, Ressa had read, was mediocre by most coalition standards. She was beginning to suspect the briefings had gotten that wrong too. A filter for what happens when the plan falls apart, Kessler said. Anybody can follow a plan. I need to know who's still standing when the plan doesn't survive contact with reality. That's the only thing this program actually tests. Everything else is scenery. The galaxy had learned, over the 2 decades since first contact, that humans made unsettling allies for reasons nobody could fully articulate in a single briefing document, which was itself part of the problem, the discomfort-resisted summary. It wasn't strength. Plenty of coalition species could outlift a human without effort. It wasn't speed or reflexes or any of the crude physical metrics the early threat assessments had obsessed over back when half the galaxy still quietly filed humanity under Deathworld species. Handle with caution out of old habit nobody had fully unlearned. It was something else. Something the coalition's own military academies had spent 2 decades trying to name and had settled eventually on an imprecise word borrowed loosely from an old human concept: endurance. Not the physical kind, though that mattered too. The other kind. The kind that did not require the situation to make sense before continuing to function inside it. The Joint Training Initiative had been Ambassador Sorn's idea, 4 years into her posting as permanent human liaison, a small woman with an outsized reputation for pushing programs nobody else wanted to be first to try. Coalition species learned fast, adapted fast, cooperated fast. What they had never been forced to develop. In a galaxy where most conflicts between spacefaring civilizations were resolved through resource negotiation and mutual deterrence long before anyone reached for a weapon, was the specific grinding capacity to keep functioning when nothing was going well and no end was in sight. Humanity, Sorn had argued to a skeptical council, had spent its entire pre-spaceflight history refining exactly that capacity out of simple bloody necessity. If the coalition wanted officers who could hold a line when the line was actively falling apart, there was only one species in known space with the applied experience to teach it. The proposal had not passed easily. Sorn had stood in front of the same council chamber that 4 years earlier had spent 42 days investigating a manufactured war and had still, afterward, taken a full generation to fully unlearn the habit of quiet suspicion toward the species at the center of that inquiry. Old fear did not dissolve simply because the specific lie that created it had been disproven. It lingered in procurement schedules, in seating charts, in the particular silence that fell over a room when a human officer walked into it wearing a coalition uniform for the first time. "You are proposing," said Councillor Meth Asa, a senior representative from a species called the Farron, whose homeworld had lost an entire border colony to a resource dispute 2 centuries earlier and had never fully trusted anyone's restraint since, that we send our most promising young officers into the direct, unsupervised care of the species our own historical records still describe, in places we have not yet bothered to update as Death World classified. You understand how that sounds." "I understand exactly how it sounds," Soren said. "I sat in this chamber 4 years ago and testified about the last time that classification nearly got an entire species destroyed for a mistake a broken probe made 140 years earlier. I am not asking you to trust humanity because the word sounds comfortable. I am asking you to trust the data. Coalition combat readiness assessments across 9 species have identified the same deficiency for 6 consecutive years. Officers who perform excellently under structured stress and unpredictably under unstructured stress. There is exactly 1 species in known space with a proven generational track record of the second kind, and it is the same species most of you are still uncomfortable looking directly in the eye." The vote passed by a margin of 3, and even that margin, Sorn suspected, had less to do with confidence in the program and more to do with a quiet, unspoken calculation running through half the chamber. If it failed, it would fail small, contained, deniable 23 recruits and 1 remote training facility, easy enough to close down and forget. Nobody in that room, Sorn included, fully believed yet that it wouldn't fail. The council had approved a trial program, 23 recruits, 14 weeks, a remote training facility in a mountain range in a country most of the recruits had never heard of, chosen specifically, according to the program brief, for whether that would provide realistic variance. None of the 23 recruits had understood, reading that phrase in their briefing packets, exactly how much variance a mountain range could provide. They arrived in 2s and 3s over the course of a single gray morning, and Ressa spent the first hour doing what 6 years of Coalition Academy training had conditioned her to do on instinct: cataloging. As, the young Vekthai, 4-legged and soft-spoken, from a species whose homeworld had almost no elevation variance at all in flatlands and shallow seas, nothing that had ever taught his people what a mountain was for. Trell, broad and calm from the Gorvath, a species whose physical strength was legendary across the coalition, and whose culture, Ressa had read, valued blunt honesty over diplomatic softness to a degree some species found almost rude. Vess, one of 4 Threlkade in the cohort, narrow-framed, quick-eyed, from a species built around calculation, uncomfortable in any exercise that didn't come with a clearly stated objective and a visible decision tree. A pair of Ilvena twins, Seth and Kor, silver-skinned and nearly silent, from a species that communicated as much through shared bioluminescent pattern as through spoken language, and who Ressa suspected were going to struggle badly with a training cadre that couldn't read a single one of their unspoken signals. And near the back of the assembling line, a recruit Ressa did not immediately place tall, dark-plated, standing with a stillness that read less like calm and more like something being carefully held down. His name when the manifest was read aloud was Karbel Asa, and he was, Ressa would learn only much later, the sole survivor of a border skirmish 11 years earlier that had cost his unit 4 lives and his own species trust in joint operations for nearly a decade afterward. 23 recruits, 8 species, all volunteers on paper. Ressa suspected, watching some of their faces in that first gray hour, that volunteer was doing more diplomatic work in that sentence than the word usually did. By day 4, 3 recruits had requested reassignment. By day 9, Ressa had stopped counting the requests, because counting them felt like counting how many times she had personally considered submitting one herself. The days did not have a rhythm she recognized from 6 years of coalition training. Coalition instruction was structured, sequential, escalating in a way that always told you, implicitly, how much further you had left to endure before the exercise concluded. Human instruction, as Kessler ran it, told you nothing of the kind. "Pack up," he said on the morning of day 9 before the light had fully broken over the ridgeline. "Full gear, we're moving." "Moving where?" asked Vess, the Threlkade recruit, uncomfortable in any exercise that didn't come with a clearly stated objective. "You'll know when we get there," Kessler said, and something in his flat, unbothered tone made it clear this wasn't evasion. It was the entire point of the exercise. They marched for 11 hours through terrain that unished every species differently, thin air that thinned Ressa's blood oxygen levels toward warning thresholds her translator implant kept quietly flagging, loose scree that made Os's four-legged gait treacherous on the descents, cold that settled into joints none of them had evolved to withstand. The Ilvina twins, Seth and Kor, walked the entire distance holding hands, Ressa noticed. Some private bioluminescent conversation flickering faintly along their forearms whenever the light dipped low enough to see it. And she found herself, somewhere around hour 7, oddly comforted by the sight of it, proof that at least two people on this mountain still had a language between them the exhaustion hadn't stolen yet. Halfway through the march, Trell sat down in the middle of the trail and did not get up. "I cannot," Trell said simply without shame, because shame was not a concept his species indexed the way humans seemed to. "I have calculated the remaining distance against my remaining reserves. The margin does not exist. I am not being difficult. I am reporting an objective fact." Kessler crouched down next to him, and Ressa, watching from 4 meters back, exhausted past the point of caring about appearing composed, expected anger. Or at minimum the brisk, efficient discipline she'd seen from coalition instructors in identical situations. Instead, Kessler said quietly, "Your reserves or your belief about your reserves." Trell considered this with visible confusion. "Is there a difference?" "Every single time," Kessler said, "you've never run this calculation on this terrain on this planet past this kind of exhaustion because you've never had a reason to. Your reserves aren't the number you think they are. They're the number you find out if you keep moving." He held out a hand, not pulling, just offering something to hold on to. "I'm not going to lie and tell you it's easy. I'm going to tell you I've watched a lot of people find a number bigger than the one they thought they had. I'd like you to find out what yours is if you're willing." Trell looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he took it and stood, and did not sit down again for the remaining 6 hours of the march. Ressa filed the exchange away without fully understanding, yet why it had unsettled her so completely. It would take her another 2 weeks to realize what it was. Kessler had not been performing motivation. He had genuinely simply not accepted the premise that Trell's limit had already been discovered, because in Kessler's experience, apparently, limits were rarely where anyone expected to find them. Carr, the quiet border war survivor, said nothing during the entire 11-hour march. Ressa noticed him watching Kessler's exchange with Trell from a distance with an expression she couldn't read, something between skepticism and a very old, very carefully guarded kind of hope. The second week introduced a discomfort none of the recruits' briefing materials had prepared them for. Not the terrain, but each other. The coalition had spent 2 decades building diplomatic protocols for exactly this kind of joint operation, careful seating arrangements, structured communication windows, cultural liaison officers embedded in every mixed species unit larger than 4. None of that infrastructure existed here. Kessler's program deliberately stripped it away, on the theory, stated plainly in the first week's orientation, that officers who could only cooperate inside a carefully engineered diplomatic scaffold were not actually being tested on cooperation at all. It went badly before it went well. On day 11, during a team navigation exercise, Vess's insistence on calculating every decision through a full probability tree collided badly with Carr's instinct, forged, Ressa now understood. In a border skirmish that had taught him decisions were often made with no tree at all, only a clock running out to simply commit to the fastest available option and adjust as new information arrived. You are guessing, Vess said, sharp with frustration neither species usually displayed openly. We have 4 viable routes. I have not finished ranking them. We don't have time to rank them, Carr said. We have time to pick one and be wrong fast enough to fix it before dark. That is not a methodology, that is recklessness. It's the only methodology that's ever kept me alive, Carr said, and something in his voice made 3 other recruits go quiet, because none of them yet knew the specific weight behind that sentence, only that it clearly carried one. Kessler, observing from a distance with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, did not intervene. He let the argument run its course, let the team lose 40 minutes of daylight arguing instead of moving, let them arrive at their rendezvous point after dark, cold and frustrated and short-tempered with each other in a way that would have earned a formal mediation S. Eshin under any coalition training protocol Ressa had ever experienced. At the debrief, he asked only one question: who was right? Nobody answered immediately. Trick question, Kessler said. You were both partly right, and you spent 40 minutes proving it to each other instead of 40 seconds proving it to yourselves. Vess, your calculation would have found the better route eventually. Carr, your instinct would have gotten you moving faster. Neither one of you is going to win this argument by being more correct than the other. You're going to solve it by learning to move while you're still disagreeing instead of waiting to agree before you move. He looked between them. The mountain doesn't care who's got the better methodology. It only cares whether you're standing on it or not when the sun goes down. Vess and Carr did not become friends that night. But 2 weeks later, during the storm that nearly cost the program its first recruit, it would be the 2 of them together who made the fastest and most important call of the entire 14 weeks. And neither of them afterward would fully be able to explain how they'd learned to trust each other's judgment enough to do it. The mid-program crisis, when it came from whether nobody had scheduled and nobody in coalition meteorological training had prepared any of the recruits to survive. It began as an unremarkable descent on day 19, a scheduled exercise, 4 training teams moving independently down separate ridgelines toward a rendezvous point, standard coalition-style structured objective, the kind of exercise every recruit had run 100 times before on 100 different worlds. Then the storm came in off the peak faster than any forecast had predicted, visibility collapsing to almost nothing inside 11 minutes, temperature dropping in a way that sent every species' physiology into some version of alarm. Ressa's team lost radio contact with command at minute 14. By minute 20, Kess, a young Avrathi recruit from a species with almost no cold tolerance at all, had begun showing the early, frightening signs of hypothermic confusion, movement slowing, speech slurring, the specific quiet danger of a body beginning to shut itself down without announcing the emergency loudly enough for its owner to notice. We need to reach the rendezvous, Vess said, calculating aloud in the clipped, anxious rhythm his species defaulted to under stress. If we deviate from the planned route, we risk. We risk Kess dying if we keep walking at this pace, Ressa said, surprising herself with how flatly she said it. 6 years of coalition training had taught her to defer to plans, to structure, to the comforting architecture of a scenario with a known correct answer. 19 days on this mountain had taught her something else. Sometimes there wasn't a known correct answer yet. Sometimes you had to build one in real time out of whatever you actually had. She thought unexpectedly of Kessler crouched next to Trell on day 9. Your reserves or your belief about your reserves. We stop, she said. Now, we build shelter with what we're carrying, we put Kess in the center where it's warmest, and we hold position until visibility improves enough to move safely. That is not the plan. It is the correct decision given what the plan did not anticipate. Vess stared at her for a long moment, the specific stillness of a species that processed decisions through calculation and had just watched someone override calculation with something closer to judgment. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. I concur, he said. I would like it noted for the record that I calculated the same conclusion 4 seconds after you stated it, and that 4 seconds felt considerably longer than it should have. It was, Ressa would think later, the closest thing to a joke she had ever heard Vess make, and it arrived at exactly the moment she needed something, however small, to hold onto. They held position for 6 hours in a shelter built from 4 packs and a length of thermal fabric never designed for the storm it was asked to survive, taking turns pressed against Kess to share body heat across 4 incompatible physiologies. None of them entirely certain the improvisation would hold, none of them willing to say so aloud. On the other ridgeline, half a kilometer away and cut off from any contact with Ressa's team, Vess's counterpart pairing, Carr and a second Threlkade recruit named Fen, faced their own version of the same emergency when Fen's footing gave way on an ice-slicked slope, and he went down hard against an exposed outcrop, a gash opening across his forearm that neither of them had the equipment to properly close. Carr did not hesitate. He tore strips from his own outer layer, packed the wound, and made the call. No plan, no authorization, no time to calculate a probability tree, to carry Fen the remaining distance to a rock overhang he remembered from. The morning's map briefing rather than wait, exposed, for a recovery team that might not reach them before dark. You are bleeding through the wrap, Fen said weakly as Carr half-carried him across the last stretch of open slope. You should have left me for the recovery team. Efficient use of resources. Efficient use of resources gets you frostbite waiting for a team that might not find this ridge before dark, Carr said. I've made that calculation before on a ridge that mattered a lot more than this one. I know exactly how it turns out. I'm not making it again. He did not explain what he meant by that. Fen, half-conscious and shivering, did not ask. But he would remember it, weeks later, as the moment he stopped thinking of Carr as the quiet recruit who never spoke of his history, and started thinking of him as someone who had already paid once for every lesson this mountain was still trying to teach the rest of them for free. When the storm broke and the recovery team finally reached both positions, Kessler was at the front of it, and the first thing he did, before checking vitals, before debriefing the deviation from protocol, was look at Ressa with an expression she had not yet learned to fully read and say simply, "Who made the call to stop?" "I did," Ressa said, bracing for the reprimand she assumed was coming. "Good," Kessler said. "That's the whole test. Everything before this was just getting you tired enough to find out whether you'd trust yourself when the plan ran out." He said something nearly identical to Carr an hour later, standing over Fen's field-dressed arm, and Ressa, close enough to overhear, noticed that for the first time in 19 days, Carr's carefully guarded expression cracked, just slightly, into something that might, in a better light, have been the beginning of relief. Between the storm and the Council's first real attempt to end the program, there was a stretch of 8 days that none of the recruits' formal evaluations would ever fully capture, because nothing about it looked, on paper, like training at all. It began with a night exercise on day 22, not a physical test, but something closer to what Kessler called, without further explanation, sitting with it. 23 recruits, no assigned task, gathered around a fire built from deadwood they had cleared themselves, in weather calm enough for once that survival wasn't the point of the evening. "Tell me about home," Kessler said, settling onto a flat stone across the fire from the group, and offered nothing further, no prompt, no structure, no clear reason for the request. It was Oz who spoke first, hesitant, still visibly uncertain whether this counted as part of the program or a rare pause from it. "My homeworld has no mountains," he said. None at all. The highest point on the entire surface is a coastal ridge 400 meters above sea level, and it is considered by my people a significant geographic feature worth visiting once in a lifetime. He looked around at the peaks surrounding them, vast and indifferent in the dark. I did not understand before this program what it meant for a landscape to be actively hostile to the creatures living on it. My homeworld has never asked anything of us. I am beginning to wonder if that made us softer than we realized. Or it just means your homeworld never had a reason to teach you something this one apparently needs to, Kessler said. Different isn't the same as lesser. I'd hate for anyone here to leave this fire thinking softness is a flaw. Plenty of the gentlest people I've ever served with turned out to be the steadiest once things got hard. Gentleness and endurance aren't opposites. People just assume they are because it's easier to tell that story than the true one. Trell spoke next, describing a Gorvath tradition Ressa had never heard of, a ritual test of physical endurance undertaken not for survival, but purely as a marker of adulthood, voluntary, celebrated, entirely without the grim necessity that colored everything on this mountain. We do this to ourselves for joy, he said, something like wonder in his voice. You do this to yourselves because your history did not give you a choice. I find I do not know which of those is the heavier thing to carry. Neither do I, Kessler admitted, and it was, Ressa noted, the first time in 22 days she had heard him admit uncertainty about anything. I've thought about that a lot, actually, whether what we're teaching you is a gift or a scar we're just handing off because we don't know how to put it down ourselves. He looked into the fire for a long moment. I don't have a clean answer. I hope it lands as the first one for all of you. I can't promise it will. It was the only time in 14 weeks that Kessler said anything that sounded, even slightly, like doubt about the program he was running. And Ressa would remember it long after she'd forgotten the exact configuration of the storm shelter or the precise angle of Os's injured leg, because it was the moment she understood fully that Kessler was not teaching them endurance as a triumphant inheritance. He was teaching it to them, carefully and deliberately, as a tool his own species had been forced to forge at terrible cost, offered now in the hope that others might carry it forward without ever needing the same forge to build it themselves. Carr did not speak at the fire that night, but he stayed until the last ember died, long after most of the others had retired, and Ressa, lingering herself, unable to fully explain why, watched him sit across from Kessler in silence that seemed, for the first time in 22 days, less like a wall and more like the beginning of a conversation neither of them was quite ready to have yet. That conversation came 4 days later in private, and Ressa learned of it only secondhand, weeks afterward, from Ambassador Sorn herself, during a visit to the facility that coincided with the Council's mounting pressure over Voth's review. You should know something about Sergeant Kessler, Sorn told her during a quiet moment away from the rest of the cohort, that he will never volunteer himself because he does not consider it relevant to the program. I think it's the most relevant thing about him. You don't have to tell me anything you're not authorized to, Ressa said, though she did not mean it, not entirely. It isn't classified. It's simply his and he's private about it, which is its own kind of dignity I try to respect. Sorn considered her words carefully. Owen Kessler served 2 decades in human military service before the Coalition Contact Program recruited him. Most of that service was during a period my briefing materials describe with typical human understatement as sustained regional conflict. He lost people under his command more than once. He has never, in the 4 years I've worked with him, described those losses to me directly. I only know they happened because I read the record before I approved his posting. Sorn paused, watching the fire pit's cold ashes from the night before. I think he teaches this program the way he does because he is trying to hand all of you the parts of what he learned that were worth learning, without handing you the parts that cost him what they cost him to learn it. I don't think he's fully decided whether that's possible. I don't think anyone ever fully decides that. But I've watched him try for 4 cycles of this program now, and I have never once seen him treat a single recruit's fear as something to be ashamed of. Because I believe he remembers, better than most humans I've met, Exactly what it felt like to be afraid and have no mountain honest enough yet to show him what he was capable of underneath it. Ressa thought of Carr's private conversation with Kessler by the dying fire, of the two of them sitting in a silence that had looked from a distance, like two people who recognized something painful in each other that neither needed to say aloud to understand. "Does Carr know this?" she asked. "Carr didn't need to be told," Sorn said. "I suspect that's exactly why the two of them sat by that fire as long as they did." The political trouble arrived on day 26 in the shape of a council observer named de Savoth, sent officially to conduct a routine mid-program compliance review, and unofficially, as Ressa would learn much later from Sorn herself, to build a quiet, well-documented case for shutting the entire initiative down before it reached its scheduled conclusion. Voth represented a faction on the council that had never fully accepted the outcome of the Deathworld reclassification inquiry 4 years earlier, not because they disputed the specific evidence, but because they resented, on principle, how thoroughly and how publicly the old doctrine had been dismantled, and how much institutional embarrassment had followed for the officials who'd built careers on it. A failed human training program, documented cleanly and reported honestly, would not undo the reclassification. But it would, Voth's faction calculated, provide exactly the kind of cautionary footnote future policy debates could quietly cite for decades. See, even the endurance program had to be discontinued. Voth did not need the program to fail through sabotage. She only needed it to look on paper like it had failed on its own. She arrived with a compliance checklist built to measure precisely the wrong things: injury rates, deviation from protocol incidents, recruit distress reports. Every metric that a program deliberately designed to stress test unstructured decision-making would inevitably generate in abundance, and none of the metrics that would ever capture what those numbers actually meant. 6 documented protocol deviations in 26 days, Voth said, reviewing the log in the observation office with Kessler seated across from her, arms crossed, patient in the specific way Ressa had come to recognize as the look he wore when he found something both frustrating and utterly unsurprising. 2 significant injuries, 1 near-fatal hypothermia incident. Ambassador Sorn described this program to the council as producing officers capable of exceptional judgment under pressure. "I am reading a report that on its face describes a program incapable of preventing entirely foreseeable harm to its own recruits." "You're reading the wrong numbers," Kessler said. "I am reading the numbers your own training log produced." "You're reading the numbers a program produces when it's actually doing its job," Kessler said. "You want 0 deviations, 0 injuries, 0 incidents where a recruit had to make a hard call with incomplete information. I can build you that program tomorrow. It'll be safe and clean, and it will teach your recruits absolutely nothing they couldn't learn from a simulation deck, because a simulation doesn't have real weather, real exhaustion, or real consequences for a bad decision. You wanted officers who could function when the plan falls apart. I can't manufacture a falling apart plan without some risk that it actually falls apart. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design." Voth was not persuaded, and Ressa, who had been called into the observation office along with 3 other recruits for a separate compliance interview, watched the exchange with a slow, sinking understanding that the program's survival had never been guaranteed simply by its results. Someone somewhere still had to be willing to believe those results meant what they appeared to mean, and Voth plainly had arrived already having decided they didn't. "Cadet Vinthal," Voth said, turning to her directly, "you made an unauthorized decision to halt your team's movement during the storm incident on day 19, in direct deviation from your assigned exercise objective. Do you believe that decision was correctly made?" Ressa thought for a moment of the easy answer, the diplomatic, hedged, carefully qualified answer 6 years of coalition training had built into her instincts, the kind of answer designed to survive scrutiny without actually committing to anything. "Well, she did not give that answer." "Yes," she said, without qualification. If given the same conditions again, I would make the same decision in the same amount of time, and I would expect to be evaluated on whether Kess survived the storm, not on whether my decision matched a plan that was written before anyone knew the storm was coming. That is not how coalition command structure is designed to function. No, Ressa agreed. It's how this mountain is designed to function. I have spent 26 days learning the difference, counselor, and I do not believe it was a waste of coalition resources to teach it to me. Voth's expression did not soften, but something in the room's temperature shifted, and Ressa understood, watching Kessler's carefully neutral face, that she had just said, out loud and on the record, something Kessler himself had been unable to say without sounding like he was defending his own program's survival rather than describing what it had actually accomplished. Voth's formal review, submitted to the Council 11 days later, recommended the program be discontinued after Cycle 1, citing, accurately, if selectively, the injury rate and the pattern of protocol deviation as evidence of insufficient risk management, inconsistent with coalition officer training standards. Sorn fought the recommendation the same way she had fought the original approval 4 years earlier. Patiently, thoroughly, and with a level of documentation her opponents rarely expected from someone with her reputation for pushing programs nobody else wanted to be first to try. She did not argue that the injuries hadn't happened. She submitted, instead, the full unedited recordings of both crisis responses, the storm shelter, the ice slope carry, alongside interviews with every recruit involved, Ressa's included, and a final, quietly devastating piece of evidence Voth's own report had failed to anticipate. Independent combat readiness assessments from 4 coalition fleet commanders who had, entirely without prompting from Sorn's office, requested advance postings for graduates of the very program Voth was recommending be shut down. The counselor's report measures the wrong outcome, Sorn told the assembled council on the 38th day of the program, 4 days before its scheduled conclusion. It measures whether the program prevented every possible harm. It was never designed to. It was designed to measure whether our officers can still make correct decisions once harm has already unavoidably arrived, because that is the only moment in an actual crisis where an officer's judgment matters at all. A program with 0 injuries and 0 deviations would have taught these 23 recruits nothing, because it would have insulated them from the exact condition their careers will eventually require them to survive without insulation. She let that sit for a moment and then added more quietly, I sat in this chamber 4 years ago and told you that humanity's entire history had built, at terrible cost, a capacity your officers had never been forced to develop. I did not promise you that capacity could be transferred without any cost at all. I promised you it was real and worth learning, however uncomfortable the learning proved to be. I believe the last 38 days have proven exactly that, and I would ask the Council to let the program finish what it started before rendering a verdict on what it accomplished. The vote to allow the program to conclude on schedule passed by a narrower margin than the original approval had, a margin Sorn would later describe privately as closer than I'd like and further than I feared, but it passed, and Voth's recommendation was tabled pending the program's final evaluation, which meant in practice that the outcome of the final 14th-week exercise would carry weight far beyond the 23 recruits standing in the gravel yard that morning, whether they knew it or not. Kessler knew it, he told none of them. Fenn's arm healed slowly, the wound tended daily by the facility's small medical staff, and for the first week after the ice slope incident, he was excused from full physical exercises, a concession he accepted with visible discomfort at being set apart from the rest of the cohort even briefly. You should not have carried me the whole distance, he told Carr during one of the quieter evenings of his recovery, watching the rest of the cohort run a conditioning circuit in the distance. I have reviewed the terrain data since. There was a recovery team within 90 minutes of our position. The risk to your own stamina was not strictly necessary. 90 minutes is a long time to bleed in weather like that, Carr said. I wasn't calculating strict necessity. I was calculating the version of that night I could live with afterward. Fenn considered this for a long moment, turning the words over with the same careful precision his species brought to everything. On my homeworld, he said finally, we are taught that the correct decision is the one that survives the most rigorous analysis. I am beginning to suspect that is only true when there is time enough to perform the analysis. I do not think there is a formula for what you did. I think there is only the fact that you did it and that I am alive because you did. That's most of what this mountain's trying to teach, near as I can tell, Carr said. Not every right call comes with a formula attached. Sometimes the only proof you get that it was right is that you're both still standing afterward to argue about it. Fenn did not have a response to that. He simply sat with it, watching the cohort run the circuit below, and Ressa, passing close enough to overhear the tail end of the exchange, thought it was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of lesson Kessler had spent 13 weeks trying to teach without ever once standing over anyone's shoulder to explain it directly. The weeks between the Council's decision to let the program continue and the unannounced final exercise were, in their own way, harder than either the storm or the political fight had been, because they were the weeks in which the cohort stopped being 23 individuals enduring the same mountain separately and became, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, something closer to a single unit that simply happened to be built from 8 different species. The clearest sign of it came from the Ilvena twins, Seth and Kor, who had spent the first 9 weeks of the program almost entirely inside their own private bioluminescent language, cooperative enough during exercises, but functionally invisible to the rest of the cohort in every unstructured hour between them. Ressa had noticed it without knowing what to do about it. The way the twins ate apart from the others, slept at the edge of the shared shelter rather than inside it, answered questions in careful, minimal assembly common that gave away nothing about what was actually happening behind their eyes. It was Trell, of all people, blunt, uncomplicated Trell, who had never shown the slightest gift for subtlety in 14 weeks, who finally asked the question nobody else had been willing to ask. You do not speak to us the way you speak to each other, he said, during a rest period on day 61, sitting across from the twins with the same plain directness he brought to everything. I do not think this is unwillingness. I think it is that our language cannot hold what yours holds, and you have decided it is not worth the effort of trying to pour it into a smaller container. I would like to know if I am wrong. The Seth and Core X changed a long look, forearms flickering in a pattern Ressa had learned by now to recognize as surprise. You are not wrong, Kor said, finally, aloud in words rather than light, the first time Ressa realized either twin had volunteered a sentence longer than a factual answer since the program began. Our bond speech carries context assembly common was never built to hold. When we translate for you, we are not simplifying a sentence. We are describing the shadow of something and calling the shadow the whole thing because there is no way to hand you the object itself. Then don't hand us the object, Ressa said, surprising herself by joining the conversation. Hand us the shadow and trust us to understand it's a shadow. I would rather have an incomplete truth from you than a comfortable silence. It was a small thing, that conversation, no crisis, no storm, no injury requiring anyone to carry anyone else across a ridge. But it changed something in the cohort's daily rhythm that Kessler, watching from a distance with his usual unhurried patience, seemed to notice immediately. By week 12, Seth and Kor ate at the center of the shared fire rather than its edge, and though their bond speech still flickered privately between them more often than not, they had begun, haltingly, to narrate pieces of it aloud for the rest of the cohort. Not the whole conversation, but enough of the shadow that the others no longer felt like they were watching something sealed shut against them. You did that, Kessler told Ressa quietly after one such evening. Not me. I don't run exercises for that kind of thing. Some of what this program teaches isn't in the curriculum at all. It's just what happens when you put people through enough hard mornings together that they stop being willing to let each other stay strangers. Week 11 brought its own smaller trial, a supply shortfall during a resupply exercise that left the cohort with roughly 60% of the rations they'd planned for a 4-day rotation. A deliberate scarcity, Ressa suspected even before Kessler confirmed it, rather than an accident. Vess ran the calculations within the hour, proposing a rationing schedule optimized by species-specific caloric need rather than an even split. A solution that would have felt to Ressa's coalition-trained instincts 3 months earlier, almost heretical in its inequality. Equal shares feel fair, Vess said, presenting the plan to the full cohort. They are not the same as sufficient shares. Trell's caloric requirement under sustained exertion is nearly triple Oss's. An equal split starves one of us while overfeeding another. I would rather we agree together to a plan that looks unequal and keeps everyone functional than a plan that looks fair and fails half of us. Nobody objected. It was, Ressa thought, watching the vote pass without a single dissent, the clearest evidence yet of how far the cohort had traveled from the tense, argument-prone group that had lost 40 minutes of daylight on day 11 arguing about a navigation route. They had learned, somewhere in the space between those two moments, that fairness and sameness were not the same value, and that trusting each other's judgment did not require abandoning their own. The final exercise of the program was never announced as final. That, Ressa understood by week 13, was itself the design. It began at 300 on what the schedule listed only as field evaluation, duration variable. No further detail, no expected endpoint. No structure at all beyond a single coordinate and an instruction to reach it as a cohort. All 23 recruits, or not complete the exercise at all. They walked for 19 hours through terrain that had, by now, become almost familiar in its unfamiliarity. Cold that no longer surprised any of them, thin air their bodies had grudgingly half-adapted to. The specific rhythm of exhaustion that no longer felt like an emergency so much as a baseline condition to be managed rather than escaped. Somewhere around hour 14, Oss, the young Vekthai recruit who had questioned on day 1, what exactly this was all supposed to be a filter for, stumbled on a loose slope and went down hard. One of his 4 legs bending at an angle that made 3 separate recruits react with the sharp, wordless alarm of people who had spent 13 weeks learning to recognize a real emergency from a manageable one. It was Trell, the Gorvath recruit who had sat down on day 9 and been told his reserves weren't the number he thought they were, who reached Oss first. And it was Trell who made the call, without waiting for authorization from anyone, human or otherwise. "We are not leaving him," Trell said, already working to splint the injured leg with what the team was carrying. "And we are not staying here either. We carry him, all of us in rotation until we reach the coordinate." Nobody argued, not Vess, whose species defaulted to calculati. On over-improvisation, and who ran the rotation schedule aloud without being asked, dividing the carrying weight by remaining stamina reserves with an efficiency that would have made Kessler smile if he'd been there to see it. Not Carr, who took the first and longest shift without comment, because he understood better than anyone else on that ridge exactly what it cost to leave someone behind and exactly how little he intended to let this mountain teach that lesson to anyone else. Not the Ilvena twins, Seth and Kor, whose forearms flickered in a steady, wordless rhythm the entire final leg of the march that Ressa, without understanding the language, understood perfectly anyway, something that looked, in any species' visual grammar, exactly like reassurance. Not Ressa, who understood, watching it happen, that she was watching 13 weeks of training arrive at its actual conclusion. Not a lesson delivered by an instructor, but a decision made, unprompted, by recruits who had learned, somewhere in the cold and the exhaustion and the collapsing plans, that the correct response to an unplanned crisis was not to wait for someone to tell them what the correct response was. They carried Oss the final 9 hours in rotating shifts across 4 incompatible physiologies, reaching the coordinate at hour 23. Exhausted past any measure the coalition had a formal category for, and found Kessler waiting there alone, no observation team, no recording equipment, nothing but a man standing quietly at a marked point on an empty ridge. He looked at the 23 of them, 22 walking, one carried, all of them still standing, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said simply, "There wasn't a passing threshold for this exercise. I want you to know that. There was no version of this where showing up counted as failing and no version where getting hurt counted against you. The only thing I was ever actually watching for was whether you'd keep making decisions for each other once nobody official was around to make them for you." He looked for a moment longer than necessary at Trell and then at Ressa and then longest of all at Carr. "You did. All 23 of you in your own way, that's the whole program. Everything else was just terrain." Carr said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight none of the other recruits had heard from him in 14 weeks. 11 years ago, he said, I made a call on a ridge that looked almost exactly like this one, and I was wrong. And 4 people who trusted my judgment did not walk off that ridge because of it. I have spent 11 years believing the only safe decision I could make ever again was no decision at all. Wait for orders, wait for structure, wait for someone else to own the outcome. He looked at Os, still being gently lowered from the rotation carry, conscious and stable, and against every early fear on that ridge going to be fine. Tonight I made the call to carry him without waiting for anyone's authorization, and I did not spend a single second of the last 9 hours believing I might be making the same mistake twice. I don't know exactly when that changed. I only know that it did somewhere on this mountain, and I intend to find out what I'm capable of now that it has. Nobody had an answer to that. Nobody needed one. Kessler simply nodded, once, the way a man nods when he has just watched the exact outcome he spent 14 weeks quietly hoping for arrive in front of him, unscripted and unforced. Ressa gave her formal exit interview 8 days later, in a plain office with a window that looked out over the same mountain range that had spent 14 weeks trying unsuccessfully to break her. Counselor Voth sat in on the interview silent, arms folded, present. Ressa understood, because her original recommendation still hung, unresolved, over the program's future. Would you recommend the program continue? The coalition evaluator asked, pen ready, expecting Ressa suspected, a carefully worded critique of human training methods, the kind every previous joint program had generated in some form. Yes, Ressa said without hesitation. Recommend it continue exactly as it is. Do not soften it. Do not add more structure. The lack of structure is the entire lesson. 23 recruits described the program as at various points terrifying, the evaluator noted, checking a report. Several used stronger language. It was terrifying, Ressa agreed. That's not a flaw in the program. It's the honest description of what it's actually training for. A mountain or a storm or a moment when the plan runs out doesn't care whether you're afraid. It only cares whether you keep moving anyway. She paused, thinking of Kessler's hand extended toward Trell on day 9, of Trell's hand splinting Os's leg on day 97 without waiting to be told it was his job, of Carr's voice on the final rye. DGE finally letting go of 11 years of silence. I came into this program afraid of the humans. I am leaving it grateful they were the ones who taught it. Voth spoke for the first time in the entire interview, her voice carrying none of the sharp skepticism it had carried on day 26. Cadet, I reviewed your compliance interview from the mid-program review. You told me directly that you would make the same unauthorized decision again under the same conditions. I want to ask you now honestly whether 14 weeks has changed that answer. It hasn't changed the answer, Ressa said. It's changed how certain I am of it. Voth studied her for a long moment, and then unexpectedly gave a small, tired nod, not agreement exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular motion of someone recalculating a position they had entered the room fully intending to hold. I will be revising my recommendation to the Council, Voth said. I still believe this program carries risks the original design underestimated. I no longer believe those risks outweigh what it appears to teach. I would ask, Cadet, that you say to the full Council what you have just said to me. I suspect it will carry more weight coming from someone who lived it than from anyone, on either side, who only read the report. On the morning the cohort departed, Ressa found Carr standing alone at the edge of the gravel yard, looking out at the same ridgeline where Oss had gone down on the final march, where Fenn's wound had opened against the ice, where 23 strangers had slowly, unevenly become something else. "You're staying," she said. It wasn't a question. The instructor posting had already gone through by then quietly without ceremony. "I am staying," Carr agreed. 11 years ago, I decided the safest thing I could do for everyone around me was stop trusting my own judgment. I have spent this program discovering that decision cost more than the mistake it was meant to prevent. I do not know how to undo 11 years in a single season. I know I would like to spend the next one trying on this mountain with people who might need exactly the lesson it nearly took away from me. Kessler joined them without announcement, the way he seemed to do everything, carrying 2 field packs he set down without explanation. "Cycle 2 recruits arrive in 11 weeks, he said. "I could use a second instructor who actually remembers what it feels like to be 23 days into this program and still not sure you're going to make it. I've been doing this a long time. I don't always remember that part as clearly as I should." "You remembered it well enough for 23 of us," Ressa said. "I remembered it well enough for you," Kessler said. "There's a difference. Every cohort's different. That's the part I need people like Carr for, not because I've forgotten the lesson, but because I can only teach it from one direction. He can teach it from the other." He looked between them both, something almost like pride in his expression, carefully understated the way everything about him was carefully understated. "You did good work up here, all 23 of you. I meant what I said on that ridge. I wasn't teaching you to survive a mountain. I was teaching you to trust yourselves and each other when nothing else was left to trust. Whatever you do with the rest of your careers, I hope you remember that part is the actual point, not the cold, not the altitude, just that." Ressa extended a hand, the human gesture she had learned by now without needing to think about it, and Kessler took it. "I ranked every instructor I've studied under across 6 years of coalition training," she said. "Whether I'd trust them to lead me into something neither of us could see the end of yet. I want you to know you're the first one who's ever scored a perfect mark." "Careful with marks like that," Kessler said, something warm breaking briefly through his usual unhurried calm. "I've found the people who deserve them least are usually the ones handing them out." "I don't think that's true of you," Ressa said. "I think it's exactly why you deserve it." She left the mountain that afternoon with 21 other recruits who had entered it strangers and left it something closer to family, carrying a fear she no longer needed to be ashamed of, and a number her own finally discovered, the one Kessler had promised all the way back on day 9, was always bigger than anyone believed before they went looking for it. Joint Coalition Officer Training Registry, Program Review, Cycle 1 Final Entry. 23 recruits entered the Trial Endurance Program. 23 recruits completed it, with 2 field injuries both fully recovered, sustained during the ice slope incident of Day 19 and the final unstructured evaluation exercise. Councillor de Sa-Voth's initial recommendation to discontinue the program following Cycle 1 has been formally withdrawn. On following review of recruit testimony and full incident documentation, and replaced with a recommendation to continue the program for Cycle 2 under existing design, with an additional note appended to the council record at her own request. I entered this review believing a program that could not prevent harm to its own recruits had failed by definition. I have concluded that I was measuring the wrong outcome. The program does not promise to prevent harm. It promises that its officers will still make correct decisions once harm has arrived, which is the only promise that has ever actually mattered in the field. I was wrong to recommend against it, and I want that recorded plainly, without softening, because I believe institutions that cannot admit an error plainly are the same institutions that produce 140 years of uncorrected mistakes. Program Instructor Master Sergeant Owen Kessler recommended in his closing report that the curriculum remain unmodified for Cycle 2, with the following note appended by his own request. Nobody passes this program by being unafraid. They pass it by learning what they're actually capable of once the fear stops being the most important thing in the room. I didn't teach them that. I just gave them a mountain honest enough to show it to them. Cadet Ressa Vinthal has been recommended for command track, effective immediately, at the joint endorsement of all 22 of her surviving cohort members. A program first. Cadet Carbellasa has requested and been granted a permanent instructor posting alongside Master Sergeant Kessler for Cycle 2, citing, in his own words, "A debt to this mountain I intend to spend the rest of my career repaying." Cycle 2 begins in 11 weeks. Enrollment: 41 recruits, 8 species, all volunteers, a number the registry notes without further comment is nearly double the size of Cycle 1's original cohort. File closed.